Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be learning about other patterns of inheritance besides the ones we've learned. So, the normal dominance, incomplete sex-linked genes. Today we're going to learn about some other patterns of inheritance besides those. So, one thing we are going to learn about is called pleiotropy. Pleiotropy addresses the issue that sometimes one gene is not responsible for one character. Instead, one gene can sometimes influence several characters, and that is called pleiotropy. So, pleiotropy occurs when you have a mutation in a gene, and it might cause a series of things to happen in your body rather than just one. So, the classic example of pleiotropy is sickle cell anemia. So, sickle cell anemia is a disorder caused by a mutation that gives you a recessive version of a gene. In this case, what happens is the recessive version of the gene gives you abnormally shaped hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein that makes your blood cells red. So, hemoglobin is going to be present in your red blood cells, and it's going to help carry oxygen. When hemoglobin is mutated, it has the wrong shape, and instead of the red blood cells having this nice, kind of like a raft shape, they form this mutated sickle shape. So those red blood cells are misshapen. Now, normally what can happen in a very small blood vessel is that the blood cells can flow right through, but cells that are sickle cells, might get caught up in capillaries and cause some blockages. In fact, there's a number of things that might happen because of this mutation, this recessive mutation. It could cause the breakdown of red blood cells, the clumping of cells, and accumulation of cells, which could then cause spleen damage, brain damage, pain and fever, anemia, paralysis, and other issues. So, pleiotropy is when there was one mutation, and that mutation caused several results. So instead of one mutation causing a pink flower or a white flower or being tall or being short, it's going to cause a number of things. This isn't the only example of pleiotropy, it's just the one example. Another example of genetics that's different from what we've learned is polygenic inheritance. So polygenic inheritance is when there is an additive effect. So that means that there's usually two or more genes on a single phenotype. It's kind of the opposite of polygenic. It's several genes making one trait. An example is going to be height, skin tone, eye color. So height, for example, will have several genes contributing to your height. It's not just one gene. So it's not that you are either tall or short, but there are many different heights you could be. You could be 5'10", you could be 5'11", you could be 6'2". Whatever your height is, there are many genes that contribute to that. The same thing with skin tone. Skin tone can be very light, it can be very dark, it can be somewhere in between. There are an infinite number of tones you can have. And polygenes can also help control eye color. Eye color is simplified by saying there's one gene, but there's actually more than one gene that controls your eye color. Here, we have an example of skin pigmentation. So usually polygenic traits have this curve, this bell-shaped curve. And what that means is that very few people are on the edges of the curve, and most people are somewhere in between. So for skin pigmentation, it basically means that there are three genes that code for skin pigmentation. If you have all dominant, you are on this end. If you have all recessive, you are on this end. That's very few people. Most people in the world are somewhere in between. So there are three genes that code for skin pigmentation. For height, there's two genes. So there can be a number of different genes coding for different traits. So in this case, in the skin pigmentation example, if you have all six dominant, so that would be six dominant alleles, the tone would be dark. And if you have very few dominant alleles, your skin is going to be lighter. In this example, the alleles are going to be coding for melanin, which is going to be a pigment. All right, and finally, the last thing we're going to talk about today are environmental effects. it is not only genetics that determine your characteristics. There are other things that determine these characteristics, including aspects of the environment. So it says here, phenotypic characters can result from a combination of heredity and the environment. One example is tree leaf shape. So genetics shape tree leaves, but then there is an environmental component. Wind, sun, nutrition are going to, in reality, affect the size and the shape of the leaf. So the leaves may have the same basic shape, but the actual shape may be quite different due to these different effects. Height, there is a genetic component. As we said, height is polygenic, but it's not only genetic, it's also your nutrition, right? If you have very poor nutrition, then it may prevent as much growth as could have been. So there is a genetic and an environmental component. Skin tone. Genetics determine your skin tone, but also the environment. Exposure to the sun or lack of exposure can affect your skin tone. And finally, flower color. So this example, they are hydrangea flowers. You see that word here. And this particular variety of hydrangea flowers will change its color depending upon what type of soil it is planted in. Flowers are pink in more basic soil, and they are more purple in neutral or acidic soil. So the acidity of the soil is actually going to affect how the genes are expressed. So it can change the way those genes are expressed. So the environment and genetics combine to give you your traits. There are potentially many examples. We don't know what all of them are. Intelligence might be one. Schizophrenia, a disease, might have a genetic and environmental component. Heart disease, cancer, right? You might be more prone to heart disease, but certain environmental components like your diet or your exercise levels may contribute to that. And the same thing with cancer. People may be more prone to cancer genetically. It doesn't necessarily mean they will get cancer. There also could be exposure to ultraviolet light, exposure to tobacco or alcohol. All of these things affect cancer rates. All right, and we are going to stop there. That is the end of our environmental effects on genetics. So if you have any questions, please let me know.